I guess, as the title of the conference suggests, we know we're here because we are wanting to arm ourselves with the ideas that we need to wage the fight to stop the genocide that we've been campaigning so hard against for 10 months now. And I guess the purpose of this talk and this discussion is to open up a discussion about the revolutionary politics and theory that we need to be able to do just that, to not only stop the genocide and the latest acts of barbarity that we're seeing from the Israeli government, but end the system of apartheid or the daily, constant violence and oppression of Palestinians, and achieve a full liberation where the people of Palestine can return to their land and live in dignity and justice. So I guess to start off, I wanted to address the most common solution that's posed to the so-called problem of Israel-Palestine, which is the two-state solution that we hear so much about from Anthony Albanese, from Penny Wong, from Joe Biden, from the Western leaders who are directly supporting and funneling arms to the Israeli regime. This is seen as a way that you could have a lasting peace. And I think the problems with it are pretty evident on a superficial level, just from the absolute unwillingness that's clear from Israel to even entertain the idea of any kind of independent Palestinian state. We've had the Israeli parliament vote with an absolute majority against the idea of any independent Palestinian state. We've had Netanyahu get up and tell the parliamentary committee that any hopes of establishing an independent sovereign state for Palestine has to be eliminated. But I think you can see, actually, in the history, in the recent history of Palestinian liberation, that the two-state solution has already been killed by events. So we had, out of the Oslo peace process in 1993, a kind of agreement that was meant to be able to work towards this idea that you would have a mini Palestinian state type thing in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But the subsequent period that has led to exactly where we are right now, it shows why there was actually never any interest in allowing for any kind of independent Palestinian state, no matter how small, let alone what you actually do with all of historic Palestine, which the hundreds of thousands of refugees in the region have every reason to want to return to. So, in the West Bank, we've had this massive expansion of settlements, that settlers are given free rein and encouragement to kill and destroy livestock and crops and steal the homes of the Palestinians living there, so that we're actually at the point where 60% of the land in the West Bank is controlled directly by Israel. They have complete apartheid control over movement of people, of goods, and it's under direct military occupation. And the Palestinian Authority that has come to, supposedly govern, actually has no real ability to govern in any way that shape or form. It's completely an appendage of the Israeli regime. And I think that becomes even more clear even when you look at the Gaza Strip, because, in some ways you have a government that has some level of independent initiative. It mobilizes its own armed forces in defiance of Israeli control, engages in diplomatic activity, organizes the delivery of services to the population independently of Israel. But despite the defiance of Hamas in Gaza, there's no way you could actually say that there is any ability for the Gaza Strip to be independent of Israel, which you can see just so clearly right now in the way that Israel's complete monopoly over electricity, over the input of food and goods, means they have the ability to just cripple the population living there. So I guess that takes us to what is the solution. And the first thing to say, obviously, is that there is no solution to the endless cycle of permanent war and violence in Palestine that does not involve a single democratic state in which all citizens in historic Palestine have equal rights, and all Palestinian refugees have the right to return to their homeland. But I think in terms of understanding how we can actually get that, because it's one thing to admit that is necessary to achieve justice, but it's very unclear from the endless cycles of violence that we've seen throughout the 75 years of Israel's history, that there's not clarity about the exact the way that you would achieve that. And I think any starting point in trying to get at how we could understand that is about understanding the way that imperialism has shaped the whole region. So I guess out of the First World War, this scramble of the big capitalist powers, the European powers that went across the world, waging brutal genocides and war to open up new markets and areas of control across the world, had spilled out into an open competition that led to a brutal war that was World War One. And actually the course of the war, as well as the state of industrial development, had really underlined the strategic importance of oil, particularly not only for the war machine itself, but for the supply of goods around the world. And the Middle East was in the prime targets of the major imperialist powers because of this. And out of the conclusion of the imperialist war, you had the carve up between Britain and France of the Ottoman Empire, and a situation where you basically had invited foreign Western powers who mandated control over the nearly 100 million Arab peoples living there, who were subject to absolute abject poverty, while they stole immense amount of profits through the natural resources. And it's this situation of imperialist domination of the region that has led to continual imperialist wars and continual revolutions and revolt throughout the region. But I think the way that imperialist control of Palestine came about, it took a particular form that was unique compared to how imperialism ruled in the rest of the region, and that has to do with the Zionist movement, which this idea of building a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine was able to really enter the historical stage in this way, because it positioned itself to have an alliance with imperialism and to fulfill the aspirations to take the land and to rule and oppress the Palestinian people living there. And this was able to get off the ground precisely because Britain, the major successor of this carve up, saw a utility in the Zionists in being able to maintain control over potentially hostile people. So you had the first British governor of Jerusalem under the British mandate, Ronald Storrs, who described the Zionists as a loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. And I think it's this buffer that provided by the Zionists and by the settler population that they oversaw that continued to be important for Western imperialism after the Second World War as well, in which Britain was no longer the major power and the US had taken its place as the dominant imperialist power in the world. And this is, the context in which the state of Israel comes about. And I think the Israeli newspaper Haaretz captured quite neatly what exactly this new Jewish state saw itself as offering US imperialism and Western imperialism when they said, Israel is to become the watchdog. There is no fear that Israel will undertake any aggressive policy towards the Arab states when this would explicitly contradict the wishes of the US and Britain. But if for any reasons the Western powers would sometimes prefer to close their eyes, Israel could be relied upon to punish one or several neighbouring states whose discourtesy to the West went beyond the bounds of the permissible. And I think it's for this reason and this dynamic that the cause of Palestine and the question of confronting Israel has always been tied to broader anti-imperialist politics and the question of confronting Western imperialism in the region more broadly. But I think the other side of that is that it has also created particular structural problems for the question of national liberation in Palestine, which are different to what has been faced by the rest of the region. And you can see this in actually out of the Second World War, you get a wave of nationalist and anti-colonial revolt and anti-colonial rebellions in the 1950s. Really threatened the dominating imperialism in the region. You had the monarchies in Egypt and Iraq overthrown by rebellious army officers, and anti-colonial revolt against the French in Syria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. But while in Palestine you had the opposite, where the hopes raised by this immense wave of national liberation and revolt were crushed by the establishment of the State of Israel and the Nakba, the forced ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, in which hundreds of thousands of refugees were pushed into camps throughout the region or into the particular enclaves controlled by the Arab states. But because of the role of imperialism in this process, the domination of Israel was always tied up. Domination of imperialism was always tied up with the question of confronting Israel, and the person who symbolized this wave of Arab nationalism and the sentiment around that the most was the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was really the champion of this Arab nationalism, came to power in the officers' revolts, nationalized the Suez Canal in defiance of the West, and openly talked about uniting the Arab states in a military challenge against Israel and the West. But this vision of the united Arab states being able to a force that could challenge Israeli imperialist domination collapsed in 1967 in the Six-Day War with Israel, in which the armies of Egypt, Syria and Jordan were absolutely humiliated. And it's in this context that the Arab states increasingly come to accept Israeli domination and themselves accommodate themselves into a system of Western imperialist control. And the flip side of that is the way that this is the turning point for US imperialism too, to see just how seriously important Israel can be in terms of guaranteeing its interests in the region, and they begin to step up their funding and military support on a completely different scale. And I think it's that context as well of the failure of the Arab nationalist regimes to provide that challenge that you see the Palestinian resistance movement increasingly look to the armed fighters in the refugee camps to guerrilla struggle, inspired by the kind of guerrilla anti-colonial struggles that had played out across the world. But for all that this was a break with the idea that the Arab states are kind of the beacon of nationalist liberation, at the same time the organization, the funding of the fighters in these camps was entirely dependent on these very same states for military support, just as they're beginning to make their accommodations with the imperialist system. And I think the problems with this bore fruit in the disastrous events in Jordan in 1970, known as Black September, which was in the context that defeat in 1967, the Palestinian fighters flee to Jordan, build up a significant base of power in the refugee camps, from which they organize attacks on Israeli and international targets. And although Fatah, the main Palestinian resistance organization, was desperate to avoid a clash with the Jordanian regime, it was clear the Jordanian state, oriented towards trying to normalize relations with Israel and the West, was determined to crack down on the activities of the armed group. And so when they did so, the Palestinian Liberation Forces were absolutely unprepared. Despite the immense revolts and the general strike from the population, you didn't have a situation which the Palestinian Liberation Forces had an orientation to taking forward the struggles, making the state unable to rule over the people. And the very same Arab states who had promised to support these Palestinian fighters, such as Iraq and Syria, simply stood by and allowed the butchery to be carried out. But I think the problem of fighting Israel is deeper than just the fact that armed struggle itself is not enough to defeat the might of such a dominant imperialist power. It's also, I think, that there are particular structural problems facing the Palestinian national revolution, which is tied up with the massive, Israeli settler population that is directly involved in and enjoys the kind of fruits of imperialist domination, while the minority, Palestinian population not only pushed out of their land and their homes, but are also excluded really from meaningful participation in the key areas that produce wealth and allow the state to function in Israel. And that was illustrated the most clearly with the First Intifada, which was, at a moment where the Palestinian Liberation Forces are becoming increasingly conservative, bureaucratized. There is an explosion of popular anger and organization that it was an absolute inspiration to people not only in the region but around the world. It was a mass mobilization, involved general strikes and popular committees, and forms of popular self-organization that made possible the kind of revolt that could see an unarmed population face down the biggest military power in the region, tens of thousands of soldiers thrown at them for years. And that showed a very different potential to the kind of action organized by the guerrillas in the camps. But it also showed a real problem, which was that while the strikes and the mass mobilizations caused a major political crisis for the regime, they were not able to actually fracture the Israeli state or pose a situation in which Israel would be unable to continue as normal. Actually, the Israeli state was able to continue to function thanks to the willingness of the Jewish Israelis settler population to replace Palestinian labor, as well as the immense economic and military aid poured in by the United States. And I think it's this structural problem which makes the question of Palestinian liberation particularly challenging, because the Palestinians living within the country don't have the social force that could break the Israeli state's power. And the states in the region that are looked to so often increasingly collaborate and work with Israel as part and parcel of that imperialist system. Which I guess this brings us to the concept of permanent revolution, which is alluded to in the talk, which is an old theory developed in very different circumstances to what we're talking about in the Russian Revolution of 1905 by the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who was trying to contend with the particularities of a situation where how was a revolution going to develop when you had elements of underdeveloped capitalism as combined with a massive peasantry and old feudal structures. And what Trotsky argued was that actually the unlike in the kind of bourgeois revolution, capitalist revolutions of the past, that the capitalist class itself was going to be quite happy to accept the Tsarist regime, the feudal regime it was living under, and on the other hand, the working class that had been brought into existence by this capitalist system had the interest and the power to really break the state in a way that other classes didn't. But having achieved, the struggle for political democracy, for an end to the feudal limitations, but the working class would have an interest and the revolution would spill over into a social revolution for socialism. And I think for Trotsky, the problem that the working class was a minority in a largely peasant society, the problems of the unevenness did mean that alone the working class of Russia would not be able to reorganize society on a truly egalitarian socialist basis. But for that reason, the whole theory of permanent revolution is connected to a very old and important Marxist concept, which is internationalism and the possibility of the revolution spilling over borders internationally. So I guess what does this all have to do with Palestine? I think the first point is that it's this dynamic where revolt can spill over between the divides between politics and economics, between democracy and social liberation, that is very important for the prospects of Palestinian liberation in the context of the structural problems I talked about before. And you can see this very clearly in the history of the revolution in the region in more recent times. So in 2011, where the Egyptian revolution, where the decade before there were waves of political mobilizations around actually, school, university walkouts and incredible boycott solidarity with the Second Intifada in Palestine. And what this did was pose very concretely the coming up against the interests of the Egyptian regime allied to Israel, that you couldn't organize meetings without being smashed by the secret police and so on. And that again fed into a popular political movement about the dictatorship as well, which is what created the basis for a revolutionary situation in 2011, in which once again the demands for democracy, political demands, fused with the aspirations for jobs and dignity, and spurred on a wave of economic strikes, which was ultimately vital in crippling the ability for the regime to function and forcing the state to abandon the dictator Mubarak. And this had direct implications for the struggle in Palestine. Like, you went from a regime directly held up, supported by US and Western imperialism, making peace treaties with Israel, trading with Israel, to a situation in which the mass of people were burning the Israeli embassy, expelling the Israeli gas companies, and opened the Rafah crossing, something so vital right now, where the counter-revolutionary regime in Egypt is helping to lock Gaza into the genocide. And I think how that happened, and the fact that the gains of the revolution were reversed and that situation wasn't able to go forward, is exactly tied to that question of the ability for a political revolution to develop its social soul. That you could go from a situation where you can remove its leader and agree to parliamentary elections into one in which you could challenge the apparatus of the military elite in power, who were able to wage a counter-revolution when that social power hadn't been there to challenge it. And I think that's also the case, that the other aspect of the theory of permanent revolution is very important too, about the ability for the revolution to spread internationally, which is what happened in 2011, where you had that wave of revolutions that spread across the region. And you can see the infectiousness of that sort of revolutionary process is exactly what can develop a situation in which a mass movement in Palestine, like we saw in the First Intifada, confused with a wider process of revolutionary transformation in the region. And this is not a fantasy at all. Right now, as the genocide is being carried out, you've got the neighbouring Egyptian regime relying thinly on a reign of terror and fear, while the minority allied to Western imperialism enrich themselves, while the vast majority collapse into third world type conditions. And I think the glimmers of resistance that we've seen in the region, but particularly I wanted to talk about the Malhala textile workers in Egypt, who were so central to the revolution in 2011, and once again, under the conditions of the crisis in Egypt, partly spurred on by the genocide in Gaza, rose up in defiance of the regime once again earlier this year, and directly made the connections that they were starvation was being used as a weapon of war on them, on the Arab people, the Egyptian people, just like it was by those in Gaza. And the Palestine protests themselves, marched in defiance of the regime back to Tahrir Square, the center of the revolution in Egypt. So I think the urgent task is to combine the anger at the genocide and the dictatorship, and for those the processes of permanent revolution to merge together in a regional-wide revolutionary process of transformation. And that's where we should look to for the hopes of Palestinian liberation.